Hello, welcome everybody. Our speaker today is Carles Casacuberta, and he will be telling us about a cordless cycle filtration scheme and topological data analysis for complex network dimensionality detection. So, Carles, take it away.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really delighted. And when you asked me to talk and you just left me free to decide, so I decided to take work in progress. I mean, this is not finished. This is going to be in the archive maybe in a couple of weeks from now. But it's something that we are dying. So, no, we are excited about it. And maybe it's better to tell about that than things which were published before. So let me just introduce my co-authors. Aina Ferrà, by the way, she's here in the audience. She's a PhD student. Robert Jankowski and Mariàngels Serrano, they are physicists. So I just want to emphasize that this is joint work with physicists. Mariàngels Serrano is a senior physicist, Robert is a postdoc, and Meritxell is a common PhD student who is also working in that. Okay, Aina is expert in neural networks. Robert and Mariàngels are really in the area of complex networks. And I am a topologist. So certainly at the end of the talk, you can ask me questions about topology. I will be happy to answer your questions about topology. But if you ask me questions about neural networks or about complex networks, I will try to answer them. Okay. Well, complex networks. I mean, a network is a graph. It's just the same thing. It's a finite graph, but when you say complex network, you assume that it's very big, right? Otherwise, you don't call it a complex network. And also typically sparse. And I like to think as a network, not really as only a small set of nodes and edges, but something which is rather determined by certain parameters. Well, maybe the parameters don't determine exactly the complex network, but certainly tell you a lot about its properties. And I'm going to start defining these. So what kind of parameters are relevant in complex network studies? Well, typically, complex networks have some properties. They have communities. Of course, clustering can be high or low depending on some parameters. The small world property is something that we should take into account, short average path lengths. And also, distributions are not random. In real world networks, the distributions are very rarely random. And assuming that they follow a power law is consistent with many examples. Examples everywhere, biological, technological, social. And basically, this structure considerations then have an interpretation in terms of the dynamics of the network or in the clustering properties, which is probably what is more relevant in practice. That's an example. That's a graph. That's just a graph. But, it's a big graph, and you see some patterns here, and some of these patterns are common to many real-world networks. So let's assume now. Let's start making assumptions. We want to do some geometry with networks. So let's assume from the beginning that we work with scale-free power law. Power law is something which is very common in the study of networks. This is what regulates the distribution of degrees of nodes. So K is typically the degree of a generic node in a network. And well, basically we assume that the degrees become very small as somehow the nodes get far away. But look, I'm saying far away. This entitles some notion of distance, right? So far, a complex network or a graph is just a relational thing. It's not a metric thing. So we really want to do mathematics and metric mathematics with it. So that's what I'm going to explain. So what are the geometries which are helpful in working with graphs or networks? So typically in a scale-free network, there are three parameters which are relevant. Of course, the power law exponent, which this controls the distribution of degrees across the network. Beta, this is more from thermodynamics, is called inverse temperature. This is something which controls local clustering. It's called inverse temperature in the sense that when beta is small, somehow in thermodynamics, you would say that the system moves a lot and the graph is quite unpredictable. On the other hand, when beta is large, it means the temperature is small. Then graphs tend to be much more controlled and have some clusterings which are much more definite. And then mu has an explicit formula, which I will show in a moment. Somehow it controls average degree, or so to say, degree heterogeneity within the network. We will see these parameters in the models that we are using. As I said, the networks that we use for our studies tend to be small world. Small world means that the typical thing that after maybe 5 or 6 edges, you can reach any node from any other node. This is the small world property. So using shortest path distances, you can do it, and you often do it to metrize graphs, are not very effective. They are not very expressive here, because all paths between nodes can be made short because of the small world property. So actually, the kind of geometricity that we consider in the study is what is called the latent hyperbolic geometry. So this is also something that physicists or complex network theorists have been developing for the last maybe 10 or 15 years, assuming that there is a kind of latent hyperbolic geometry is consistent with many, many properties of networks that have been studied. I would say we can also study, of course, Euclidean embeddings. Any kind of geometric embedding gives you a notion of distance, as we really want. And of course, distances in the model should be somehow related to proximity in the sense of popularity of a node which has many neighbors, or the two nodes are very close for some reason. While as you get far away, as I said, the degrees, because of the power law, become very small. Then a hyperbolic spaces model real networks much more accurately in terms of explaining their properties than Euclidean geometry. This is known. Here's a reference. Here's a reference. But this is more a survey. I mean, the topic is old, and actually, even you can say that a given network is more or less congruent with an underlying latent geometry, just regarding to what extent the hyperbolic geodesics correspond to shortest paths in the network. This can be more or less accurate. Of course, some networks adapt very well to a hyperbolic geometry, and others not so. That's just an assumption. That's here 2 examples. That's just the internet, the bull trade. Now you understand why really putting them in the Poincaré disk somehow may be an expressive way of depicting a network, and you understand better the properties of these very large real-world networks than trying to use Euclidean embeddings, which would definitely not be appropriate. We're going to generate networks. It means in order to do calculations, we take, of course, some models from a real world, but typically from each real world model, we produce hundreds or maybe thousands of tens of thousands of synthetic copies. We call them surrogates, and for that we need a model. And that this is not recent work. I told you that we have co-authors who are physicists. So this SD model, this is something that they developed at least 8 years ago, something like that. And it's just a geometric model where you, of course, you have to choose some parameters, and the parameters are the ones which appear here in the formulas. I already told you about the beta, which is the inverse temperature. I already told you about the degree heterogeneity, which is the mu here. And n is the number of nodes. So basically we are placing the nodes on a sphere. I would say, okay, you set hyperbolic space, and now you talk of a sphere. I will clarify this in a moment. But basically you put dots randomly in a sphere, but the probability of connection between two nodes is determined by a kind of gravity law. In this case of a gravity law, where the inverse temperature exponent is relevant, the radius of the sphere has an effect, and the dimension on which you work is crucial. So whenever you take a real network and you want to create surrogates in a specific hyperbolic dimension, your choice of dimension will tell you whether you are accurate or not. It can be that the real-world network adapts very well to hyperbolic space of dimension 15, but doesn't adapt well to hyperbolic space of dimension 4. It may be. So let's assume that there is an optimal, this is kind of working assumption, no? That every real network has an optimal latent dimensionality, meaning that representing it in hyperbolic space of that dimension reflects its properties very accurately. That's more or less what we do here. And then you see that in order to decide, so first you place those nodes at random, and in order to decide whether they are linked by an edge or not, there is here an angular distance in the sphere, which, as you will see in a moment, this is treated as a random variable. So you place basically nodes everywhere in the sphere, but the probability that two of them are connected is something which is predicted in advance. It's fixed in advance. Now, I'll explain a little bit more of this with pictures.
A quick
by the
question.
way,
So here, this hidden degree is a variable that you choose, or are you
the
effectively
degree,
building?
it's in the network. So typically, you take the network and you count the degree of each vertex. The degree is the number of incident edges. But I
Yeah,
think in
but
practice,
so you start with a network that already has edges?
no, exactly. We start with a real-world network, then you count everything which
see.
is here, and then you can produce 10,000 surrogates, which you use for statistics, and you use for, in our case, for doing topology. That's there, yeah. And the isomorphism now, definitely in the next one, I promise there is a picture at last. So actually using the sphere model or using the hyperbolic model is actually isomorphic. We use the sphere because it's easier, but we have to think in hyperbolic space for motivation. And actually, there is a transformation from one to the other. And allow me, please, to pass to the next page before discussing on those formulas. This is what makes everything much more transparent. This is the S1 model for networks. This is the H2 model for networks. And, well, here, all the nodes are placed, of course, in the boundary. And then you decide whether there is an edge between two nodes or not, depending on those formulas that I showed you in a moment. Of course, there has to be, we don't say a real world network because it may be that you do that on a network which you produce itself. Maybe we call it the original name network or the mother network or the whatever. So you start with a network that you know very well, and then you can produce many copies of it in a sphere, but putting it into a sphere is equivalent, I mean, it's isomorphic in all possible senses to putting it in the Poincare disk. And this is what really gives us an interpretation. So hyperbolic distances in the H2 models is what your intuition would tell you about two nodes being close to each other, or of course, nodes with high degree tend to be in the center of the disk. And the ones in the boundaries, the ones which under the power law tend to have low degrees. And the difference is that here nodes are very big. So when a node is very big, then in the disk it goes close to the center. Now you see the isomorphism. The size of a dot in the spherical model corresponds to the proximity to the center in the hyperbolic model, but the two of them are mathematically equivalent. However, calculations are much easier with the SD model than in the HD+1, because here, of course, you would need true embeddings. I mean, for geometric analysis, I think that we mathematicians would like more a model of that kind, but for calculations, it's more feasible and easier to use a spherical model. And I repeat, the positions of the nodes are random. They are, but precisely by playing with this randomness, you can generate many examples where the dot just change in the position, and the edges between them also appear randomly according, now I go back, according to these formulas. So actually, you have quite a freedom in producing surrogates, but they have to follow some rules. Namely, they have to have the same parameters as your original network. And the isomorphism now again between the spherical model and the hyperbolic model. This, if you're interested, you can read in the papers of our co-authors, because basically they developed these methods. I will show you a couple of references later. Okay, now we know what we mean by hyperbolic models. And this is just the language. Sometimes we say surrogate, sometimes we say synthetic graphs. And each time I say we are generating graphs, it means that we use the SD model. We use the SD model, and you have to give as a parameters the number of nodes that you want, which, as Daniela said, it comes from the network that you have to start with. The inverse temperature, I remind you, it controls clustering. This is the power law exponent, which controls the distribution of nodes, and those are the degrees in the original network. And as I said before, the angular distances are treated as random variables. Actually, there is software for that. So our co-authors have software. You give them the numbers, and they create as many graphs as you want, placed on a sphere of dimension d. And now all the work is about which is optimal d. So you have a real-world network, which is the d, which is producing surrogates, which really reproduce in the fairest possible way the properties of your network. That's what our research is about. We have to find the optimal dimension under several working assumptions. We are assuming a power law distribution with certain parameters. We are assuming that the network is congruent to its latent hyperbolic geometry. Of course, there's a lot assuming. And in practice, some networks don't match well with the models. Maybe we can see this, but others just match perfectly. Others don't match, they don't let themselves be modeled as easily. There are many networks in the world. Okay, yeah, so first 10-second break. This was my presentation of some kinds of complex networks. Now let's do topology. I'm not an expert in complex networks. I'm not an expert in topology either, but I have been doing topology for several decades. So let's do topology with graphs. Let's do topology. Actually, a graph is finite, undirected, simple. Simple means no loops, no double edges. And then, of course, we want to do persistent homology. So we need a filtration on a graph. And a filtration on a graph is most often obtained by putting weights either on its vertices or on its edges. You can choose. You choose a weighting. You can choose vertices and edges. And let me allow a little bit of mathematics here. Well, of course, now I'm among mathematicians, so I should not apologize for being a little bit theoretical. So let's discuss a little bit what is the, so to what extent a filtration on vertices gives one on edges and conversely. First of all, our finite undirected simple graphs are just one-dimensional CW complexes. So we want this to be a filtration compatible with the cell structure. So you have to assume that every weight on a vertex is less than or equal the weight in an edge which is incident with it. Then, whenever you choose a weighting, assuming that you have both weighting on vertices and edges, then you can filter the graph. You can use the typical sub-level graph filtration. It's a sub-level set, but well, they are sub-level graphs. They are subcomplexes. So they are subgraphs. And the sub-level graphs, and with the sub-level graphs, we shall do persistence. Actually, here, this is quite obvious to you. This is the way to produce weights on edges once you have weights on vertices, and conversely, to obtain weights on vertices when we have weights on edges, and both formulas amount to the as I said before, the cellularity compatibility. Weights have to be compatible with the cellular structure. However, this is a technical thing. I will pass quickly on it. But in order to convert an edge weighting to a vertex weighting, that formula is not the best thing. It's not the best thing, and maybe you will understand why in a moment. So there is a better thing to do. We call it a blow up or a resolution of a graph. Actually, for persistence purposes, it's much more convenient to change a graph where there are weights on edges and vertices have a certain degree to a blown up, which every vertex of degree 4, like this one, is converted into 4 vertices. And a vertex of degree 3 is converted in 3 vertices, and then you put edges according to the previous edges. But now, somehow, the edge weighting has resulted in a vertex weighting which is much more, I would say, fair. You will understand the difference between the two in a moment. Technically, they are topologically identical, except that this is a kind of resolution of the previous one. But for topological studies, there is no difference. However, there is a difference that you will see. And now somehow the picture suggests is that the stratifying of weights is much clearer here and is not so clear here. This is something which for the moment I don't justify fully, but this transformation from edge weightings to vertex weightings is relevant for calculation purposes. Well, now
can I ask a question about the previous?
Yes, sure.
So what's the difference in this blow up between? So you have these gray edges and blue edges.
Yeah. So the blue edges are the previous ones. So here from B to D, there was an edge. Now this edge is the one which appears from B sub D to D sub B. And the gray ones are just the new ones. They are phantom edges, which were not here. And then we don't even have to put them away. So we want weights on vertices, which are compatible to these, and that they are actually stratified, which is not what happens here. And the reason to want that, you will see it in a moment. But the gray edges are just irrelevant. Of course, topologically they count, but they don't play a role.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, you will see why. So now let's filter graphs by taking. By the way, this is an example of a filtration with a degree. The degree filtration is the most popular one. It's weighting on vertices, and you put to every vertex the degree as a weight. Then this is a graph. By the way, this is taken from a paper of Bastien Ric and Robin Ballester. They published it, and this is due to Bastien, and it's a typical example where you filter a graph by the degree filtration, and then you count persistence. I assume I don't have to explain persistence to the audience. So, but a detail is that the homology classes which persist to infinity in the case of graphs are relevant, because those are precisely like in manifolds. Those are the ones which give the Betti numbers of the graph. So it's the classes which persist until infinity. They give the connected components and the number of independent edge cycles of the graph. However, so they are important topologically, but they are useless computationally, because classes at infinity, we typically drop them when we do calculations. That's where the issue comes from. So yeah, our invariants, we want to do analysis, we want to predict dimensionality. So our descriptors are total persistence, you know that. But of course, to compute total persistence, one normally takes the finite points in the persistence diagram. You don't include the infinite ones. So basically, if you use standard persistence with graphs, now we will see an example, all the dots are in the infinity. So total persistence in dimension 1 would not be very expressive. You know what is total persistence? So typically it's the total lifetime of all the cycles, but normally we exclude the ones at infinity. And we don't want to do that here, because of course the full thing will be about it. So we use extended persistence. So mathematically, one of the ingredients that we have is using extended persistence. So now the meanings of B and D are different from usual. So B is going to be the smallest parameter value at which some edge of the cycle appears in the sublevel filtration, and D is going to be the smallest parameter value at which all the edges forming the cycle are in the sublevel filtration. Or if you prefer to do it, D is the birth parameter in the sublevel filtration, and B is the birth parameter in the superlevel filtration. So it's basically, that's the idea of extended persistence. You sweep the graph twice, going from bottom to top, and then you go back from top to bottom, and then magically cycles become of finite lifetime. Extended persistence is not a new thing. It's been around for many years. And there is software. There is software to compute it. And in the case of graphs, using extended persistence is really very convenient. Here's an example. Yeah, those pictures are due to Aina, so thanks to her that she's here. But you see the difference between ordinary persistence and extended persistence. In ordinary, this is filtered by the weights which you can see in the edges. And then ordinary persistence had, yeah, of course, almost everything at infinity. Extended persistence has everything finite. because you sweep twice the graph, first from bottom to top and then from top to bottom. And that's the reason why we want to resolve graphs in the way we did. If we use the original graph, then either the sublevel filtration or the upper level filtration does not give subgraphs. It is something which doesn't really work. If we want to have subgraphs in both directions with the same weights in the edges as were given, you have to resolve the graph in the way I explained before. It's just to allow this double sweeping to be consistent with the incidence relation in both directions. That's it. I don't give further details, but you will understand that for extended persistence, it's very convenient to blow up the graphs in the way we did. And now, well, since every graph now gives finite points in the persistence diagram, now we can start computing. So that's enough for mathematics, end of mathematics, and let's go to experiments. Yeah? Let's go to experiments. This is not recent work again. So people in this area, they know a lot, and they know biological networks tend to be of very low hyperbolic latent dimensionality. So here's a nervous system of a worm. There's a connectome of the human brain where nodes are just regions in the brain, and then edges correspond to actual axon connections. And then it's quite well known that the worm is very low dimensional, that the nervous system of the worm, in any way you do it, there are many ways to predict dimensionality of a network. There is not a unique way to do it. We just will propose another way to do it, but other people have done this before. And typically these kind of networks are very low dimensional, but certainly the dimension of the human connectome is larger than the one of the worm. This is well known. This is well known. Typically, the precise number is not so relevant, but of course, 1 is very different from 5, just to give an idea. And it's never larger than 10. That's amazing. Even the most intricate real networks like the internet or so have dimensionalities in the range of 8, maybe 9, which is surprising. Very surprising. So they fit very well in low-dimensional hyperbolic models. That's an experimental fact, which has even received some theoretical attention and some explanations. It's not just a phenomenon that has been found by experiments. Oh, yeah, here's just to see the difference between ordinary persistence and extended persistence in these two cases. If you use ordinary persistence, everything is up there in dimension 1. So you can do very low level calculations with that. However, extended persistence gives very rich diagrams. By the way, typically, if you are used to extended persistence, points are below the diagonal because birth times are later than death times. But we just to stick to a standard conventions, we reflect it so that we put points in the upper quadrant, but typically extended persistence should be down there, because remember that the birth is when the thing starts forming in our convention, and the death is when it closes. So they are up there. But that's no, typically the birth is when it closes. So here we have a convention. So those diagrams, somebody in the audience may say, hey, they are not correct. Well, just because we reverse them and the ones below is the ones that we use for calculations, not those. Not those. So extended persistence is our tool. Now another mini break, 5 seconds. So that was for the topology, the topology persistence. Now let's go, all this, so to say, is essentially well known. Now what we pretend to be innovating is that we are finding a new filtration scheme for graphs. Actually, it's not our discovery. Our co-authors already used these chordless cycle densities in their previous work. So this is somehow continuation of their work. Now I will define what are cycle densities, but our physicist co-authors, they found these, and they found that those cycle densities were expressive for dimensionality detection, so that they were making these definitions and these calculations for the purpose of detecting dimensionality. What we did is say, okay, let's do this topologically. So now you compute some numbers, you use these numbers to infer dimensionality, you have your algorithms. Now let's do topology. Topology means let's take your densities as weights for a filtration. And now let's do persistent homology, and let's see if the results are consistent with yours. It was just an experiment which was successful. So they had some weightings which they were using in a different manner, and we took these weightings and we converted them into filtrations on which we computed extended persistence, and we compared the two things, and as you will see, the matching is very, very convincing. So to define density of triangles, this is a way that you put on every edge. It's a way that you put on an edge. Then you count how many triangles contain that edge in the graph, and you count how many triangles could contain that edge. So it's a kind of normalization. It's not only the number of triangles that contain an edge, but you normalize it. This is actually used in many other, this is an old thing which is called something, the local clustering coefficient. It's a well-known thing. It measures something which is relevant. It tells you a lot of the graphs. And you can also do this with the squares and pentagons. There is no reason why you stick to triangles. Actually, this is an idea of our co-authors. Let's take, well, chordless, because you don't want them to interfere with previous triangles. Let's take chordless squares, and let's take chordless pentagons, and let's count again, let's normalize each of them, but the number of such things which could be there, and let's use these as weightings. So now we have three different weightings on edges. Remember that the weighting on edges is a function from the set of edges to the reals. So we have a function corresponding to densities of triangles. We have another weighting corresponding to densities of squares, another weighting corresponding to density of pentagons. That's perfect because we have several weightings. You would say, well, and hexagons and so on, but no. But then it turns out that the numbers become very low. So all our studies were done with triangles, chordless squares and chordless pentagons. And I remind that this is a weighting. Each of them is a weighting. So each of them gives a filtration and hence a persistence diagram for each graph. Here's the paper where I should be referring. So this ultra-low dimensionality, well, this is quite recent work, is that thing that really even the most complicated real networks don't reach dimension 10. It's a paper of physics. It's very interesting. There's no topology in it. There is no topology. But they found that those densities were efficient predictors of latent dimensionality with other methods. Well, typically, then what we do is, given a graph, we take those three weightings, each of them counts as a filtration, then we generate surrogates using this as the model, as we discussed at the beginning, with a range of dimensions. So typically, given a real network, we produce copies of it in each dimension, and then we try to guess which of these dimensions is producing the best copies. I mean, the copies which are closer to the original network. So you are given a network, and then we generate surrogates in every dimension, and we analyze which of these dimensions is more accurate to the original one. But on which ground? What does it mean to be more accurate? Well, closest in terms of topology. Closest in terms of topology. So this is for the human connectome, and then the color is the surrogates in the corresponding. So this is generated by a spherical model, SD, but in many dimensions. And it gives persistence of triangles, persistence of squares, and persistence of pentagons. It's triples. So I go back, sorry. So typically, you compute total extended persistence for triangles, squares, and pentagons. So we have points in three-dimensional space. The red ones correspond to surrogates in dimension 1. The orange ones correspond to surrogate in dimension 2, and so on. And the numbers here are already topology. It's persistence under the filtration corresponding to the densities of triangles, squares, and pentagons. So this is new work. This is not the way our co-authors were using those densities, but this is the way we use these densities. And it happens that the dimensions separate very well, very nicely, even surprisingly nicely. And then, of course, you take the original real-world network or synthetic network, you take the target network on which you started, and then you compute its persistence, and then you use a KNN to guess dimension. This one, we would assign dimension 1 because the black cross is closer to the red strip. That's how the algorithm goes. We generate surrogates, which are the colored points. We take the target, the original network, and we look where it fits better. And this predicts the dimension of a network. You generate surrogates, you draw the colors, and then you place the real network, and that's your estimation. That's the method. Sounds reasonable. Here's also two-dimensional. Instead of a 3D, you can use 2 dimensions, and each of them is consistent with dimension 1. Maybe this one would be confusion. I told you, dimension 1 or 2, it's not that important whether it's 1 or 2, but it's certainly not 8. That's the point. So those are plots, 2D plots. The other one is a 3D plot. We use a 3D plot typically to produce then tables of results, and the dimensions match quite well the ones which were known to our co-authors. So basically, topology does the same work. Say, well, so on. What do you obtain? Topology is just doing equally well, not better, but it's doing the same. But it's good to know that topology is working, is performing here as well as before. But wait a moment. No, those are confusion matrices. Well, I go this a little fast because I'm running out of time. Here, this is comparing the dimensions that we predict with the true dimensions, and well, really the confusion matrices are very satisfying. Of course, sometimes we produce wrong. By the way, we can compare because the original network here is also synthetic. We also start with a synthetic network, so we can compare the original network, of which we know the dimension because we constructed it, with many surrogates of itself. And then our method says that topology can see this dimension very well. Well, I don't discuss the numbers, but typically those beta and gamma, this is the inverse temperature parameter and this is the power law, there are ranges in which things are better than others. Now, I don't give many details, but it has a physical interpretation that for certain values of beta and gamma, this is very good, and for certain values of beta and gamma, it's so-so. But it's also true with the state-of-the-art methods. It's not only a problem of our method. Oh, yeah. Now, that's the last break. Now it comes an argument. You would say, okay, if your method is good at predicting, so to say, the dimension of a given network, why don't you try to create a kind of a universal dimensionality predictor? Let's say, what have we been doing? You give me a real world network, for example, connectome of a human brain. Then we compute several parameters. You compute the hidden degrees, the number of nodes, beta, and so on, and then you produce surrogates, many of them. Then you plot persistence, you plot the original network, and you predict dimensionality. Well, do you have to do this each time? Because now if you give me another network, I will have to do all that work again. Why not training a neural network once in a while, only once, and use this as a universal predictor? This was another new idea. I don't think this has been done before in this setting. Of course, using a neural network as a kind of universal predictor, it's something which is very often done, but not in this setting. So we started by creating a huge database of synthetic graphs, almost 800,000, with many different parameters. And we use that to train a neural network. So basically, it's using our method, but we trained a neural network with a huge database, and then we have a machine trained and prepared so that you can come with your favorite network, you put it there, and it gives immediately an estimate of the dimensionality. We tried this, and it works. It just works. So actually, in our database, each graph in the database is associated several parameters. That's number of nodes, that's average degree. This is called the normalized second moment. This is the minimum degree. This is the maximum degree. This is called the mean average neighbor degree. So those are things that people in graph theory typically use as features of a graph. So in our database of 800,000 graphs, each of them is labeled with all these numbers and the average triangle density, the average square density, the average pentagon density, and our topological persistences. Those 12 features are stored in the database, and they are used to train a neural network. So the neural network learns from this. And this is the architecture. This is a multi-layer perceptron. It's not a very complicated network. So we didn't attempt to optimize, so to say, the accuracy of what we do. Now I'll show you the accuracy. This is going to be my last slide. I'm going to show you the accuracies, but we don't attempt to be very, very, very accurate. We just attempt to show that the method works, so this is quite a standard architecture for a 10-label classification problem, which is the dimensions from 1 to 10. And we allow dimensions to range from 1 to 10, not beyond 10, because there are no such things, or because of ultra-low dimensionality. So we train a perceptron with the database. And, well, actually, this is a little bit fancy. Maybe I don't extend on that. But those are the 12 features of the vectors. So we try to not do all of them at the same time, but try to combine them. Basically, the idea is to see to what extent topology is important. That's another outcome of doing this. It would be very deceiving if, after all the work, the classical degree-based descriptors plus the densities would do the work. If topology would not add anything to the classifier, then using topology would be an anecdote. It wouldn't be relevant. So we tried all possible combinations, only classical degree descriptors, adding chordless cycle features. Those are, I repeat, average triangle densities, average square densities, average pentagon density, and these are the total persistence. But look, when the total persistence entered the game, it's when the accuracy is really maximum. So topology does something. Extended persistent homology of graphs is not only seeing things that other descriptors already saw, it's seeing something else. Topology is seeing a little bit more than all these things combined, which is good things for topologists, just a little bit. But no, we jumped from low accuracies to really, 83% accuracy for a 10-label classifier is quite good, and it could be better. I'm sure that if we work more on the architecture, we could improve that. And moreover, just let me show, there are many numbers here, but maybe this is more convincing. This is the accuracy that a neural network would obtain with only topology, with only other methods. State-of-the-art means all those, basically, state-of-the-art typically means density. So the densities of chordless cycles alone, with no filtration. And this is our topology filtration. So the summary is, and by the way, this picture is common to everything that we have done with TDA so far. We have been doing TDA for 5 years now. And at the end of every work, it's always the same. We have some state-of-the-art. If we do persistent homology, we don't match the same accuracy. But when the two things are put together, there is an increase. That's always the case. So topology should not be seen as that's what we tell to our students. Don't attempt that persistent homology is competing with other methods. It's enhancing other methods. Because when you add persistent homology to other methods, accuracy grows. It's a little bit what we saw in the table before. It adds sometimes just a little bit, but it adds something. And in some cases, it adds a lot. And above all, it adds explainability. So in many cases, topology does not only increase accuracy, but also adds explainability. But of course, it's clear to you that that's because we used extended persistence of cycles. Otherwise, in the domain of graphs, it wouldn't work. So it's very important to use extended persistence of cycles to, actually, we tried many things. This is the summary of almost 2 years of work. So we tried many things. And I tell you that other things don't work. We tried to do it with connected components. It didn't reach the same number, the same level of accuracy. We tried entropy instead of total persistence. It didn't reach the same level of accuracy. It has to be total persistence. That's, so to say, my conclusions. Extended persistence in homological dimension 1 of surrogate graphs in hyperbolic models are just the best thing to estimate latent dimensionality among all the TDA tool work. If you try to use other topological data analysis tools, it's just our experience, it won't be as expressive in this context as extended persistence in homological dimension 1. in complex networks. Maybe you have other ideas, but this worked well. Chordless cycle densities. This is a new idea. It was invented before, and it was used differently. Using it to filter graphs, it works very well. And not only for dimensionality. Actually, in the meantime, we tried these filtrations for other tasks, and it works very good. It's a very expressive filtration, even in graph classification problems, isomorphism graph detection. It works very well. It's better than curvature, for example. The curvature filtration on graphs is a new thing which is very effective, but this is even better than curvature in the terms that it reaches higher accuracies in isomorphism classification. And, well, that's a general fact. A neural network has this magic thing that you train a neural network, and if it's trained on a large enough database and you do it properly, then this serves as a universal machine where you can just now bring an arbitrary network and it will tell the dimension, and it will get, well, of course, you don't know the dimension of a neural network. You don't know whether it's doing something correct or not, but it matches the state of the art very accurately, very accurately. Yep. Thank you.
Thank you for the talk. So maybe we can unclap ourselves and thank Carlos for the talk before doing questions.
Thank you.
Thank you for such an interesting talk. So if you have any questions, you can either write them in the chat or better just unmute yourself and ask them.
Yeah, I have a question. Hello. Yeah, so as a practitioner, I'm kind of taken aback that there is zero consideration for noise in the data, because in my experience, if you introduce noise, whatever dimensionality estimates you do, they become unseparable. You can't separate this in the presence of noise.
Oh, are you suggesting that by perturbing a little bit the network's dimensionality can grow?
No, I suggest that if you did, you had these beautiful plots where you have clear separation of dimension, right? But that's a pure data based on pure model, right? So if you introduce some noise that is agnostic to hyperbolic geometry, these clouds that were clearly separated in your picture would become completely intertwined.
That's very interesting. And have you an idea of where we should? What does it mean introducing noise in the context of a network?
Well, you have no. Okay, so you Let me try to do mathematical description. So you have particular probabilistic model, right, for generating your weights, right?
Yes.
So now you just add random noise that knows nothing about your geometry. Right.
But in the model, so you would add a noise factor.
You literally add noise to probability, right? So you add noise to probability, you regenerate your network, and
it's a very nice idea.
My 2 cents is your clouds will stop being nicely separated the way you showed it. In fact, we tried it ourselves and with slightly different methods, but also topological methods, and that was the unfortunate answer. We could not figure out dimension in the presence of any significant noise.
I appreciate, of course, that's something that we will try to do.
And another comment is that, of course, the true reason to use topology is not that it's doing better or worse, but it's stable to noise, right? There is stability theorem, right? And the like if you combine this sort of graph like degree unstable to noise, as far as I understand, then it also goes out of the window for the same reason. So, but then all I'm asking, did you entertain introducing noise at all or not? No. Yes. No. It's a binary.
No, it's definitely something we should try.
Okay.
I don't know.
So yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
Anybody else?
Carlos, may I?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Of course.
Thanks, Carlos, for the talk. I think one of the obvious questions is, there are some works of Ginestra Bianconi about the emerging hyperbolic geometry this kind of complex network, but from the simplicial point of view originally. So have you, and I also know that your collaborator, Mariàngels Serrano, has also worked on that. So have you started to think about, simplicial version of these studies?
No, I don't think she has done anything like that. But let me try to understand. So when you take simplicial embedding, so what are the higher simplices here? They are higher relations or what?
I mean, you don't start by a graph and you ponderate a graph, but there are some works of Ginesta, Bianconi, and Courney where they generate a synthetic algorithm. I mean, they give a synthetic algorithm to generate simplicial networks. There is no proper mathematical or analytical point of view to know if it is a power law or no, but there is some inverse temperature. There are some, same parameters as you do have there. But I don't know if this kind of techniques should work there.
No, it's a very nice thing again. If I had to do it, I would be more inclined to phrase it in the language of hypergraphs, maybe.
Okay.
Somehow, taking simplicial examples is a special case, right? But if you say that we are extending from graphs to hypergraphs, it may look more natural to specialists. And then, well, we can do the same. But of course, as you say, the models are different, right? Because I don't know to what extent these hyperbolic models could fit well with hypergraphs. I have no idea.
Yeah, the point is, I don't know in the hypergraph case, but in the simplicial complex work, there is not a proper book like Network Science book of Barabasi and this kind of things. So it's not complete, the analytical study. So
come to Barcelona and let's talk about it.
Okay, yeah, sure. Thanks for the talk, Carles.
Thanks for being here.
For the work.
Marcus, can you?
Yeah. Hi. Thanks for the great talk. Curious to get some intuition about this chordless cycle density. And so in particular, I'm wondering if it can detect some sort of ring structure on the network. So if you're familiar with the Watt-Strogatz model.
No, I know about it. I know about it, but I cannot predict what's going to happen with it. No, but just let me know.
Okay. No, I was just wondering if there's like if nodes are more or less arranged in a circular array, and then they're connected to their neighbors, but then it shouldn't be too regular, so we should be able to allow for some noise. I would be wondering how the chordless cycle density would behave in this setting.
Maybe this kind of big structures that you have in mind are not local. This is a typically local weighting. So given an edge, you just look around it to put a weight. That's maybe my guess that it won't work to match things which count large cycles. However, I said that we have done more things with this chordless cycle filtration, and we realized something, that there is one descriptor from graphs which gives very similar values and very similar expressivity, which is called the betweenness relation. The betweenness parameter, or the betweenness count of an edge in a graph, it has to do basically with how many shortest paths contain the edge and how many could contain the edge. It's the same idea, but then it's global. So I suspect that this betweenness way could be related to what you say, because then for an edge you are allowed to go as far as you want, as long as they are shortest paths. Yeah, in a small world networks, those shortest paths will most of the time be small polygons. But technically it's global, because from that edge you can go anywhere, and then this could be related to you. Of course, this betweenness weight is costly to compute, because you have to search the full graph. However, counting triangles is very cheap. And squares and pentagons are also relatively, it's very fast. I mean, all these things that we did with neural networks would be unfeasible if these parameters were complicated. to calculate.
Yeah, okay.
They're very cheap, and that's what it's amazing that being local, they give that much information about the network.
Yeah, I see now. Yeah.
Just to add on that, it might work for preferential attachment because preferential attachment tends to make like a ring kind of structure globally, but the building process is very local, right? You add one node and then you will add a node. And then what you say is how do you connect it to other nodes? And the probability of having an edge is given by the degree of the root node. And then you continue this process iteratively until you reach all nodes. And this is, I wonder how this process relates to starting with a degree distribution and then adding an edge with a probability given by the product of the degrees, which is what this sphere model was doing. It might also work.
Okay, well, I'm taking notes. I'm not in the world of complex networks. I'm just a user or, let's say, a co-author. So I will read about that, definitely.
I have a question. Have you looked at directed graphs? So C. elegans is directed, for example, and I think you just discarded the direction here, I assume. But the cycles, you can look at chordless directed cycles, or you could define this in the same kind of way. I'm wondering if you've thought about that.
That's another nice idea. It's another nice idea. Wow. Wow. Well, I think everything has to be done from scratch. Just use the same ideas in a different setting, but everything should work, right?
Yeah.
But then, look, let's do topology. If you have a directed graph, how do you compute the ordinary persistence? Is there a software, is there a name for that? Is this a kind of zigzag? No, I'm not sure. No, what is this? So when you put directions on the edges of a graph, how do you compute just ordinary persistence?
You can do it the same way, right? You can think of it as a CW complex. It's not a simplicial complex, but it's a CW complex. So you have the 0 simplices and the 1 simplices. And then people are actually doing higher dimensions by taking 2 simplices every time you have like a click. But you can also do just the 1 dimension version as you do and just.
By the way, I assume then you allow double edges, one going in one direction, another one going backwards. Yeah, then yeah. No idea. Never done it. Never done it. Sounds, but I mean, look, before putting this into that work, I would like to learn persistent homology for directed graphs or something that I have not done before. It just looks exciting.
Are there any more questions from the audience? And in that case, I would say we can thank Carlos again, and we can stop recording, and you can ask your secret questions after the recording has stopped.